disasters often bring out the best in people, but they can also bring out the worst. We've experienced in the last 10 years lots of large-scale natural disasters. Earthquakes come to mind, tsunamis. But when I first preached this sermon, it was right after the earthquake in Haiti in 2010. And that was a pretty devastating earthquake. Since then, we've had earthquakes in Nepal, and much of what I say here could apply equally to those situations, unfortunately. But on the internet, that's probably my first clue. I should have stayed away from the internet after things like this happened. But shortly after the earthquake in Haiti, someone said this: "The terrible earthquake was an act of God. Haiti stands for voodoo rituals, horrible human and animal sacrifices, devil worship, and other abominations." End quote. Sadly, that's tame. A rather large personality in the evangelical community said this: "Haiti is cursed because of its pact with the devil." When disasters like earthquakes happen, it's all too easy to say or to think something like that. It's all too easy to resort to God was punishing sinners logic, or they deserved it because of fill in the blank. But the book of Job tells a drastically different story. This is a very ancient story. It's probably set somewhere between 2000 and 1500 BC. This is the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But the difference here is that it seems to be set outside of Palestine. It's set before, in other words, it's set before Moses and the law. But that doesn't mean that Job wasn't a man of faith. The story tells us that Job is blameless and upright. Job feared God and turned away from evil. This does not mean that Job was perfect, because no one's perfect. But what it means is that Job was a good man, and he had a strong faith in God. And Job's faith in God had a positive impact on the decisions he made and the life he lived. Job was also a successful businessman. Lots of sheep, camels, oxen, donkeys, servants. If we were to put this into modern parlance, he had a few Beamers, a 5-car garage, blah, blah, blah. And so financially, Job was doing all right for himself. But Job was also a family man. 7 sons and 3 daughters. And lest we get too caught up in the details, the numbers 3 and 7 and 10 are significant because they're biblical numbers of wholeness or perfection. In other words, what this book is telling us is that Job had what was considered the $1 million ancient Near Eastern family. He had it all. And Job's family was a happy family. There's no dysfunction here. His children enjoyed one another's company. And this is where I start to think, okay, is this fiction? So much so that they partied together on a regular basis. It wasn't just Job who was fortunate. Job's children were blessed because if they were paying attention, they had a father who cared about them and reminded them of the importance of knowing and having respect for God. And at this point, it would be easy to come to another conclusion, a very simplistic conclusion, and it's this: those who have a faith and character like Job are the ones whom God blesses, and God blesses them big time, and only them. That's right. If we get it right, God will give us the Canadian version of the American dream. Now, that probably involves copious amounts of maple syrup, Tim Hortons coffee, Molson Canadian if you're into that, the Tragically Hip Library, I don't know. But again, Job tells us a different story. Instead of giving us explicit spiritual laws that confirm or deny these conclusions, the story switches scenes. And this is where it starts to get really interesting. In verse 6, we're given a glimpse into heaven's throne room. The translation I read said the angels came before God. Literally in Hebrew, it's the sons of God. That's just another term for the spiritual beings who serve God and live in His presence. Angels is fine. Technically, there's a difference, but we won't quibble about that this morning. So these sons of God, or the angels, have an audience with God. But there's someone else there, one of these sons of God, who stands out. And again, the translation here that I read from the NIV, the old NIV, it says Satan, like a proper noun, a name. But in Hebrew, it's actually a title. And they should have translated, I don't like to criticize translations in public, but this is a big one. They should have said, the Satan. Ha-Satan in Hebrew. The adversary or the accuser. And it's confusing. And I'm going to, spoiler alert, we're not going to solve this problem this morning, but I just want to talk about it for a second. Who exactly is this character? Well, the knee-jerk reaction is easy. This is the devil, the same character who was at work in the Garden of Eden, but not so fast. I'm not saying that's wrong, but I'm saying it's a little more complicated than that. Genesis 3 doesn't call the serpent or the snake the devil or Satan. And Job, and as well as a passage in Zechariah, present this, the Satan, as kind of a functionary of God's court, an officer of God's court. And it's a little bit confusing to take all of these passages and try to put them together and say, okay, who is this Satan figure? James Crenshaw, an Old Testament scholar, puts it this way: the Lord's master spy is on the road to becoming a hostile agent. I think that's an apt description of this character we have at work in the book of Job. And certainly later, the serpent and this Satan figure were thought to be one and the same, or at least the name Satan is applied to the serpent. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We're not going to settle all of this morning, as I said, especially the questions of fallen angels and maybe even more difficult, when this happened, when this fall of some of the sons of God or the angels of God. If you would like to have a head-spinning Canada Day, go home and read First Enoch. You can find it on the internet. You'll be thinking, whoa, what were they ingesting before they wrote that book? But I'll say this. Given his conversation with God in the passage we just read, the Satan lives up to his name. What are the Satan's accusations of Job? Job fears you, God, because you have blessed him. Because you have blessed him. Does Job fear God for nothing? That's not really a question. It's a not-so-veiled accusation. You've put a hedge around him, God. You're protecting him, but strike Job and he'll curse you to your face. And so the match is set. God's in a no-win situation. If God doesn't do what the Satan asks, God looks like he's afraid Satan is right. If God does do what the Satan asks, God appears heartless. We know what happens. Job loses everything, his property, his possessions, and most of all, his beloved children. Now, a few personal comments at this point. One of my reactions to Job is, at first, I said earlier that it's one of my favorite books, but before I say that, I would say, I'm not sure I like this story. Those two things may contradict each other, but I don't care. I'm not sure I like this story. if they had Facebook back then and I read this story, 4,000 years ago, I would have hit the dislike button. And then maybe I would have hit the heart button, but whatever. There are a few things I don't like. First, I don't like that there's this character called the Satan. I don't like that the Satan is a troublemaker extraordinaire. Whoever he is and however we tie him to other figures in the Bible who are evil, he seems to take great pleasure in making people suffer, or at the very least, he seems to think that the test of somebody's character is more important than the people being put to the test. Someone like that is our worst nightmare. When people take pleasure in making other people suffer, or they put kind of a principle before the actual soul of a person, we have a name for such people, and it's psychopaths or sociopaths. And the wider biblical picture of Satan is kind of like that, except he was great in power and great in influence. 1 Peter 5:7 in the New Testament paints this picture, and it's even more sinister. It says, "Our enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour." And I don't like this. But just because I don't like it or you don't like it doesn't change reality. And the reality is the accuser accuses people. Have you ever felt like you were being accused unjustly? Revelation chapter 12 talks about the great accuser of the brethren, to use the old King James, the accuser of the saints. Have you ever felt like you've been accused unjustly? The reality is the accuser prowls around looking for someone to devour. Have you ever felt trapped in the middle of a bad situation? The accuser tempts people. Have you ever really wanted to do something you know you shouldn't? I know you probably never felt that way. It's just me. The accuser deceives. Have you ever found yourself doing something and asked yourselves, why the heck did I do that? I knew better. And this brings me to something else I don't like. The fact that the Satan has the freedom to do these things. Why does God allow Satan to do what he does? Why doesn't God stop the Satan in his tracks? Why does he let him carry out this little test? Not so little. Why doesn't God stop, all sources of evil in their tracks? These are big questions. And anytime we ask these why questions, we run the risk of giving simplistic, cliched answers. Or just as bad, especially when it comes to spiritual forces of evil, if I can put it that way. We can try to fill in the blanks and turn speculation into established facts. And that's just a hop, skip, and a jump away from superstition. And that's ripe in the church at times. But one thing that has begun, and I stress that, it's begun to help me make sense of the Satan in the Old Testament, but especially in the New Testament, and evil in general, is this. One word, actually. Freedom. Did you see the movie? I can't believe I'm going to ask this question in church. Don't raise your hand. Have you seen the movie The Stepford Wives? That's right. Don't raise your hand. The women of the town have been replaced by look-alike robots who are mindlessly submissive to every whim of their husbands. And some of the men are thinking, that would be fantastic. No, it wouldn't. Not really. The Bible reveals very clearly that God is not in the business of making mindless robots. First and foremost, our God loves his creation, and he wants to be loved by his creation, me and you. And as we know, love can never be forced. It's not really love if it's forced. We've been given a wonderful but dangerous freedom. In fact, there's freedom that permeates every inch of God's creation. And again, it doesn't mean that we don't wrestle with things like trying to reconcile that freedom with God being in charge or his sovereignty, to use the $10 theological word. And I think it's fair to say that the natural world has been granted a God-given freedom. And I think this may account for at least some of what we don't understand about nature and how it operates. Maybe even things like earthquakes and so-called natural disasters. And of course, humans have been given a God-granted freedom. And this helps explain even more the mess the world finds itself in. In his book, The Problem of Pain, C.S. Lewis writes that humans have always wanted, and I quote, some corner of the universe in which they could say to God, "This is our business, not yours." But that corner doesn't exist. To act as if it does is really the definition of sin, which has and continues to mess things up in all sorts of ways. So neglect and abuse of God's creation can impact the environment in all kinds of ways that we probably don't even realize. And I'm sure Jim could give us a long talk about that. And I'm not saying that the reckless treatment of the environment is the only cause of earthquakes like the one in Haiti or Nepal or wherever, but it may have been a factor. And we often don't think about it from this perspective. If the government of a given nation and the governments of the world had done more to help the people in those places develop better infrastructure, if the government of the people of the world, including Christian people, did not turn a blind eye to rampant poverty that is quite literally sometimes in our backyard, maybe the impact of things like natural disasters would be sufficiently less. But that's an important aside, but an aside nonetheless. Come back to freedom. That has to do with our freedom, taking care of the least of these and making sure that when disaster strikes, things are minimized. But it would seem from our story that even angels, heavenly beings, the sons of God, including the Satan himself, have been granted freedom. The freedom to love and serve the Creator or to rebel against Him. We sang in a song this morning. There's a line, the God of the angel armies. I don't know anything about that song. Do you know when it was written? Yes? Last 5 years? Okay. I think where they got that expression from was from Eugene Peterson's translation of the Message. You might remember from the Old Testament the expression, the Lord of hosts, or Yahweh of hosts. That's Peterson's translation of that phrase, the God of the angel armies. I like that. And the biblical story paints a picture of many, many of these beings being faithful to God, righteous angels, but some have rebelled. They have the freedom to act in ways that are harmful to the world, including us. Now, again, I don't have this picture all figured out. When it happened, the mechanics of it, we could spend years speculating. But they have this freedom. And I will say this too. I don't know what role, direct or indirect, these beings play, the fallen beings play in the world. What their role is in natural disasters. But I will say this. It is always insensitive and reckless and self-righteous to say that we know definitively that Satan had his way with certain people because they are so immoral or corrupt or fill in the blank. Because what the story of Job tells us is that is not true. Does it start off by saying that, Job spent most of his days in Vegas at the slot machines and with prostitutes? No. No. It says that he was a righteous man. He even provided sacrifices for his children after they had partied, just in case they cursed God in their heart. This is a man who's above board, who fears God and shuns evil, yet bad stuff happens to him. If we don't get that message from the book of Job, then we're missing something vitally important. And as followers of Jesus, we can't succumb to the temptation that Satan has the last word, or that there's nothing that we can do to help those who are suffering. 1 John 4, verse 4 says, "The one who is in you is greater than the one who is in the world." And the one who is in the world is envisioning there the chief of the spiritual forces of evil, Satan, the devil. So whatever we do when disaster strikes, and regardless of what is behind it or what caused it, our prayers, our financial gifts, our practical help, whatever we can give is important. What is not an option, though, is to literally be the devil's advocate and abuse our God-given freedom to be Jesus' hands and feet and ears to those who need him. Now, very briefly, I want to mention one more dislike, if you'll let me get away with it. And it's this: my limited understanding of the way God works sometimes. I'm just kind of bringing together things I've already said. I'm an analytical person. I like to know how things work. I like to have things figured out. And in many ways, this is an exercise in frustration. And so in my humble opinion, spending time in the Scriptures proves the truth of Isaiah's words. Chapter 55, he says, "For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts." We may not like aspects of this story. We may not understand what is our abuse of the planet rearing its ugly head, or what is the spiritual forces, what are the spiritual forces of evil at work, or a combination thereof. But one of the things that mystifies me in some respects about this story, even more than all of that, is this. I find it difficult, to wrap my head around Job's response. At this, Job got up, tore his robe, and shaved his head. Then he fell to the ground in worship and said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." I don't understand Job's response. After losing everything, I don't know, and I'm saying this honestly, I don't know if my response would be Job's response. I hope it would be, for two reasons. Because I know it is ultimately the best response, and we can and people have debated the accuracy of Job's assessment. After all, he says the Lord gives and the Lord takes away, but it was Satan who had a role there. That just goes back to the question about God giving freedom to his creatures. Regardless of all of that, the difficult, but I think the best response is to place our lack of certainty, our pain, in the hands of our Creator who loves us. And this is why. This is what brings us to the table, and this is why we gather here this morning. Centuries after Job is set, the story is set. The Christian story is that the God of Job and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob became a man and identified with all human suffering, whatever its cause. And Jesus certainly believed that at least some of the suffering in the world was due to Satan's influence. And we see this most fully and powerfully and completely in the cross and in the resurrection. What Jesus accomplished for us means forgiveness and power, the same power that raised Jesus from the dead. Jesus said, in this world you will have trouble, not you might have trouble. And he said, take heart, I have overcome the world. Jesus also said that he came to bind the strong man and to plunder his house, and he was referring to the devil. So, are Satan and evil at work in this world? Absolutely. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to see that. But do Satan and evil have the last word? No. Not according to the message of the gospel. The cross and the resurrection guarantee that the Satan and evil are on the way out. And one of our greatest hopes as Christians is that one day all wrongs, all injustices, all sources of evil and their power, including the ones, maybe even especially the ones that we don't fully understand. So do we have to live in fear that evil is going to win the day? No, we don't. In light of this, may Job's response ultimately be our response. May we turn to God regardless of what life throws our way. May our prayer be that God's kingdom will come on earth as in heaven, and that God would lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one and the evil of his devising, as well as our own. So when tragedy strikes, may we also know that we can voice our frustrations to God. Job does this, not in this passage, but later on. And it's the second reason why I hope my response would be Job's response. Because later on in the story, Job is free to question God, and he gives us the flip side of what it means to place our lack of certainty into God's hands. Sometimes that includes giving God a big piece of our mind. And maybe we'll look at that another time. Let's pray. Father, we freely acknowledge before you this morning that we don't understand how this world works. We can turn on CNN or go to cbc.ca and we can listen to the news or read the news, and sometimes it's downright depressing. People exploiting others, we exploit the environment, and we have no idea the full impact those things have on your world. We also acknowledge that we don't know the extent to which spiritual forces of evil are at work in our world. But we do know this, that we serve a God who has conquered the power of sin and death. We thank you that Jesus came to bind the strong man, and that he not only did that, but plundered his house. We have your power at work within us. May we rely on that to live as you have called us to, but also not to be discouraged by the things around us that can only be described as evil, and those things that can only be described as bringing about suffering. we entrust ourselves to you and ask that you would comfort us and help us as only you can. In Jesus' name, amen.